Hey everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to my Top 5, a series where I intend to talk about things I like in the industry rather than moan about state of affairs like I normally do. But instead, this time I have another Wishlist themed episode for you, with Fractal Audio Systems being the target of all my wishes, as this video is going to kind of pick up where I left off from on the Fractal versus Kemper versus Line 6 versus real tube amps and guitar gear video, because as long as that video was, there was plenty more I could have talked about and things that I would have liked to see on all of those products. But because Fractal Audio Systems is the one that I felt came out on top and has continued to do so since, well, 10, 15 years ago with the second generation Axe-Fx, and I thought I would throw out some of my ideas into the giant proverbial FAS themed wish list hat. Although most of these ideas are not new, they're not novel, they're not original, they probably exist out there on the Fractal Audio forums, although there's a couple aspects of these that I've not seen asked for specifically. But these are the ones that would be super important to me. They would be things that would be a day one purchase, or if, they could be added in software for some of these software themed items, they would pretty much render most other gear obsolete or make me stop buying certain classes of gear. Because Fractal Audio Systems finds themselves in a bit of a weird position for me, where it's so good, it's so authentic sounding, and they've taken it levels beyond of what many of the competitors are doing, that it's kind of transcended just a good guitar modeler. It's almost to the point that it is not only a one-stop shop for effects, and potentially you could use it as an outboard device for even mixing and mastering should you choose, because so many of the effects are that good, but it's almost to the point that I kind of treat these devices as like a gear and tone preservation machine. And I think a lot of people are starting to view modeling hardware in that same vein, where, okay, I don't need to have this collection of chorus pedals because they're all in here. And not only does it do those sounds and do them just as good, it can do more sounds than that. So it doesn't really make sense for me to collect my favorite rack choruses or chorus pedals because they're all in here, or drive pedals or what have you. And for a long time, there existed this gulf of things that were on the Fractal side or the Line 6 side or the Kemper side or whatever model you're looking at, and the things that were not modeled. And, to have it all, you kind of still had to have analog gear. But we're quickly approaching the functionality of these units to be exceeding everything you could buy. And I think this is what that wish list kind of revolves around. If these things could be added, I'm not getting rid of any of these tube amps or real cabinets, but they'd probably start collecting dust. So my wish list isn't going to be presented with any particular order, other than the first couple of items deal more with hardware, though there are certainly software aspects to them. And then the remainder will be purely firmware driven, although it may require, say, a hardware upgrade, maybe a Gen 4 Axe-Fx platform to see some of these things through. But it's really worth noting that many of these wish list items have been changed since I kind of was thinking about this concept, because Fractal keeps getting to them. If I had like a my top 10, my top 15 kind of wish list, they've gotten a good majority of them already, which it kind of gives me hope that many of the ones that are remaining will be addressed at some point. For instance, within the past couple of days of filming this, the FM9 got the 6.0 beta firmware that includes all the changes to the most recent full-fledged Axe-Fx 3 firmware, which includes gapless switching. Of course, there is still some latency, between the time that you press the switch and it changes over to a new scene, or changes over to a new amp, or changes over to an entire new preset. Sometimes you might see, a 30 to 100 millisecond gap, depending on how loaded it is. But there's no more audio dropout at all, which is, stuff that other competitors have been able to do, but not to this extent, not with this many effects going on at the same time, not switching back and forth, between 100 different banks. And that sort of thing falls into the category of wish list items for me that are not super critical. They're things that you can work around. All you got to do is, especially if you're playing in a live environment, time those changes before the beat drops, and most of the time it's not going to be noticeable whatsoever. But this is one more thing that brings it closer to real gear or supersedes it, depending on what kind of circuit you're switching between. There are some tube amps that drop out longer because of the way the relays work. And it's one of those things that now no other competitor can really hang over their head. So that's fantastic. Before Axe-Fx Gen 3, I had wanted USB audio interface capability on the floorboard series. We got that with FM3, FM9. And there were plenty of amp and effects models that I had basically written off as impossibilities, things that had been asked for time and time again, things that, you know, they had said, oh, it's coming, and it just didn't for years. And I thought, yeah, that's something that you're just never going to be able to get on this platform. And lo and behold, we actually get a Klon model. We actually get the Rev amplifiers. We now have a Mesa Mark V subsection. We've got the VHT big bottom cabinet IRs. We've got those big angelic shimmer reverbs and plex delays. And before I go into my wish list, I just want to express how grateful I am for these continued free updates, because frankly, you know, as a hardware company, Fractal Audio Systems doesn't owe their consumer base anything. And that's why I really appreciate their work, and I continue to support them, because if they just left all these devices as they were day one, they'd still be fantastic. But you keep getting these free upgrades after the fact, and it's an evolving platform. And you know that by the time the next one rolls around, you are starting from that point as a bare minimum. It's not like previous product launches from other companies where you build up this entire effects library and then it's basically scrapped again. And that's something that is really important to me, is that continuity and the fact that the owners and operators of this company really give a damn about the fidelity and authenticity of their effects and growing it out. So again, thank you to the Fractal Audio Systems team for continually supporting your product, making something that is pro-consumer in my book, and that's something I normally don't say often enough to companies that I've given thousands of my own dollars to. But you know, this is kind of a standout example, and I don't want to come across as a whiny brat of give me more freebies in this video. This is simply, you've done this, no good deed goes unpunished. I know you could do it. Let's see what you got. Can you completely drive out all the competition with a few new add-ons? One last aside before we get into it is that I did have a previous wish list video about guitar gear in general, and I think a couple of those ideas could be implemented here, especially if it was, you know, either integrated directly into the unit or Fractal made their own version of these things and sold them after the fact. There was one idea I had for a foot switchable pickup change, or something that could change over MIDI instead of having to, you know, slap a little three-way or five-way switch on your guitar. Why not make it like relay driven or motorized, or something that could go between your pickup sounds that was controllable from a foot switch? Because there's plenty of tones for me where I would exclusively use the bridge pickup on a rhythm sound. I would exclusively use, say, a single coil neck sound on this clean thing, or like edge of breakup, you know, mildly overdriven lead. And if I could have that sound just with a foot switch, and that be changed over MIDI or just changed in the Fractal Audio FC universe, that would be incredible. I think they could honestly do that. Of course, you're getting into custom electronics at that point. There'd be soldering involved, all that. But I think Fractal could make their own guitar line at this point, or at least team up with someone in the same way that they've teamed up with other manufacturers here recently. And that perfectly brings me to my first wish. At this point, both Kemper and Line 6 have a in-the-room cabinet modeling solution with the power cab from Line 6 and the Kemper cab / Kemper cone. Now, these are things that can be used as traditional FR cabinets. You keep your cabinet modeling, you know, your impulse response on, and you send that front of house or direct signal into these cabinets. You got an on-stage monitor, what have you. The more intriguing use case for me, since we already have things that can do that, or, you know, you can listen through in-ears, whatever, is the fact that you can disable that cabinet impulse response or cab profile and use the power cab or the Kemper cone as a regular in-the-room cabinet. And the way they do that is they basically have a near FR flat speaker, as full-range flat response as a 12-inch speaker can be, and they use essentially EQ profiles to emulate, say, a Celestion Vintage 30 or a GT75 or a Greenback or some sort of Eminence driver. And this is something that is lacking currently with the Fractal Audio Systems firmware. It's not something that I think is going to be the biggest selling feature, but everyone else has it, and I just know based on how Fractal is, they could do a better job than what the competition is doing. I could see the hardware implementation of this going a couple different ways. Right now, Fractal actually has a partnership, seemingly, at least, with Red Sound, and I think this would be a perfect point of collaboration for them. There are Celestion kind of full-range drivers you can buy, slap a 1-inch tweeter in there for the FR, which they're seemingly already doing with the products that are currently offered, and disable that tweeter. Basically, you use the 12-inch speakers only, and you would send, instead of the cabinet impulse response side of your signal chain, you would break off at some point prior to that and send it some sort of flat signal, basically one without cabinet impulse responses. Now, I think the best implementation would be to do something like Kemper does, where the EQ correction is happening on the device. That way you just have, your XLR cable, and that's basically it going to that device. You wouldn't need, say like an FC controller, XLR, or especially MIDI to change anything on the speaker itself. It's just a dummy speaker, preferably a powered speaker for those that don't have an external power amp. And that EQ correction curve to make that onboard flat speaker sound like a Greenback or sound like an Eminence, that would be coming from the unit itself. There's also an implication here for using your own custom source cabinet, something that has maybe either a speaker that is specifically made for Fractal Audio Systems, or maybe they give you some sort of measurement tool to use something similar to a Kemper Cone or that full range Celestion speaker. Because basically all you need to know is what's your target, what do you want this speaker to sound like in the room, and what does it actually sound like without correction. If they could dynamically change the reference, as in, okay, here's what it sounds like actually in the room. Now, how do you measure that is questionable, but if you could, how does it sound in the room? How do you want to make it sound? And here's your EQ correction and potentially any other impulse response based things they could do, then that would be phenomenal, because, in that instance, I would certainly want to build out my own, say, like offset 2x12 to have kind of a 4x12 vibe without all the weight, or if they could just sell all those permutations, that'd be great too, to have a 1x12, to have a 2x12, a full-fledged 4x12, or a split 212 system for a stereo application, though you get into a lot of SKUs with that, and that causes its own set of problems. The point is, I think they could do a lot of these speaker in the room kind of EQ corrections and be able to implement it in a way that you don't necessarily have to buy their cabinet, because that's kind of been their MO is, you buy the Fractal Audio stuff, but they've endorsed other, speakers and amplifiers in the past as well. They haven't had their own brand, but I think if they could do it with Red Tone and make it competitive, then that would be a fine option as well. Either way, if you could get an in-the-room sound that is appropriate for blues jams, or just, when you want to hear a big rattly cabinet like I do sometimes, that would be a game changer. I list speaker modeling as my first wish, as an otherwise perfect signal chain can absolutely be wrecked with a bad filter at the end, or in this instance, a bad speaker sound. But what's also important is the beginning of your signal chain, which brings me to wish number 2. This, for me, would have to be a wireless transmitter and receiver from Fractal Audio Systems, and not just because I think they need to rebrand a Shure unit and slap their name on an existing product. No, I think they could do it better than anyone else. Besides having to worry about batteries and the potential for interference and all the things that most people think of when it comes to drawbacks of a wireless system, one thing a lot of people don't think of, especially in a modern context, is the way that it buffers your guitar signal. Now, most of the time, this is actually a good thing, because you want to preserve the load on your guitar pickups, and whatever it's seeing after the fact, well, actually the circuit isn't seeing it in an electronic sense. It's simply like you had a buffer tuner in front of your signal chain. And again, for most modern types of signal chains, especially if you're playing some djenty or thrashy kind of metal, that's probably what you want. But the problem comes with, if you're a more vintage effects heavy player, if you like fuzz pedals or if you like treble boosters, you lose some of the magic of those pedals because they're very impedance sensitive. Meaning if you plug a guitar straight into, say, a fuzz face or straight into a Dallas Rangemaster treble booster, it's going to react very differently than if you put a buffer in between those, such as a Boss pedal. Because the input impedance on these pedals is so much lower than your run-of-the-mill contemporary pedal, it actually loads down your pickups and it kind of forms its own subsystem, if you will, to the point that you can roll off your volume knob and it cleans up so much better than if you were to have a buffer in between, because again, it kind of acts as its own one discrete circuit. And a lot of people, kind of ride the volume or ride the tone to get these kind of crunchy but still mostly clean sounds when they use a treble booster or a fuzz face in front of something like a Plexi. I say all that because on amp modelers, traditionally, this is also a problem. You are buffering the signal before it ever touches that digital signal path. So stuff like that aforementioned fuzz face or Rangemaster treble booster doesn't really work. It sounds okay, but it doesn't sound right, especially when you start rolling the volume off, and even when it is maxed out, the frequency response isn't right. But Fractal Audio Systems and many other amp modelers before them have been able to overcome that by making the first part of the input circuitry for their amp modelers variable impedance. And in fact, you can actually add some capacitance in there to emulate long cables. So depending on the first block in your signal chain, say you've got a drive pedal with that Rangemaster treble booster model, it'll actually knock down the impedance to be closer to what the real pedal is. The result? Well, your guitar actually reacts the way that it should. Volume roll-off behavior is right. The amount of gain on tap and the overall frequency response going into the pedal sounds more correct. This is something you lose as soon as you use a wireless system. And again, for a lot of players, this isn't going to be the end of the world, because if you are into those vintage effects, most people have just gotten used to the fact that you need a cable. But for a lot of other people, they're not using those vintage effects. They might be using a tube screamer or a noise gate up front. So it's not something that's really going to affect them. But what about those that want to be cable free, or for just someone at home like me that wants to walk around like an idiot with a guitar plugged in, but still wants to be able to have that vintage roll-off behavior? This is where I think Fractal Audio Systems could justify a wireless system for their amp modelers. There's a number of different ways Fractal could potentially implement this, and I'm kind of torn on how they should do it. I don't really think it should be integrated into the unit itself, because that's yet another SKU and another thing that could break later on. So I kind of think it should be its own discrete black box in a sort of similar dimension and form factor to the FM9, FM3, though if it's a Gen 4 exclusive, match it to that, of course. Obviously, the receiver would plug directly into whatever input you want, but I think it needs some sort of control, whether it's MIDI. I don't necessarily know you want to waste MIDI on that. Maybe it could daisy chain, have an input and output for the FC, like the FC6, FC12 cable, and that would be able to transmit from the unit, whether it's Axe-Fx or FM series. It would be able to tell it what the input impedance is on that unit currently. So if you put, the drive block up front with the treble booster, it's at like 10K. If you have a gate or a tube screamer, it's going to be like 1 mega ohm. That information would be transmitted to the wireless receiver, and with that information, it would make the decision to basically replicate that signal on the transmitter. So not only do you have the wireless guitar signal coming from the transmitter, the receiver itself would actually have to be a bit of a transmitter too, because it would have to tell the guitar transmitter to change impedance. So essentially you would have that first little circuit bit in the FM9 and Axe-Fx3 in the transmitter itself. That's what the guitar would see. And then on the fly, of course, as you change it, it would, switch a relay in there. Now, maybe this is too much for a battery to handle long term, and it would need to be rechargeable, all these sort of things, but I think it could work in practice. It just might be giant in a prototype stage. But if they could do this, that would basically eliminate any and all concerns for all players to get an authentic kind of drive tone, no matter what their signal chain is. I would buy that for $500 or under, and I don't even play out anymore. That's awesome. Now let's get into the software exclusive stuff, the bread and butter of what all the rabid Fractal Audio users are screeching on the Wishlist forums, and I feel their pain on some of it because, well, I actually feel both the pain of the Fractal Audio Systems teams and the user base because it's a lot of work for them. I get it. They're doing a lot of things that is way above and beyond what any other company is doing. But at the same time, from the user base perspective, there's this sense of, well, you've done this. This was harder. Why can't you do this? This seems simple. We've sent you a schematic. It's all out there. Hell, Line 6 has done it. Why can't you do it? So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. But for some of my big software and model related wishlist features, most of this is going to be models. My number 3 wish would be a true double tracker. I have yet to find anything outside of a Neural DSP plugin. It's kind of probably a curse word to them. And I believe Vadim Taranov has a pretty good implementation of it. But those are the only software solutions outside of the TC Electronic Mimic that actually sound like real double tracking to me, or at least as good as it can. It's never going to be as truly wide sounding as real double tracking because of those innate differences. But those are really good implementations, and no amount of the step modulated like delay stuff I've ever tried in the FM9, it doesn't get there. Now, the enhancer, the stereo enhancer, the doubler, the stuff that's in there is really good in its own right. I really like using it, especially to add more depth and space in a headphone environment or even just sitting in front of here, but it's not double tracking. It's not the same thing. It doesn't have the same feel. It would not shock me in the least if the Mimic has some sort of patented algorithm and it can't be replicated entirely, but I'm pretty sure Line 6 has a model of it. And even if it's not the same thing, I think Fractal Audio Systems could do it, whether it belongs in that enhancer block or it's an entirely new thing or just built into something else. I'm not quite sure, because the best case scenario would be to have it in its own block where you could put it after your entire signal chain, which in my experience doesn't work so great. But I think you would have a stereo input on one amplifier or mono inputs on 2 amplifiers, hard pan them, and put that effect beforehand, and it's going to sound super huge, and that would be great for guitarists that want a kind of a double track sound either at home or live, but they don't have a second guitarist, and sometimes it's really necessary. It'd be really cool if you could put that effect and then add some sort of harmonization on the other channel to play stuff that you normally couldn't in both channels and still sound double tracked. That would be insane. So if they can nail whatever TC Electronic did there, again, that would be another pedal. It's like, why do I even have it around? Like that, it's not something I normally need, but when I do, it's probably in a halfway digital hybrid rig anyway, and I would just assume use the Fractal stuff for it. I don't exactly know what the secret sauce is, but it seems to me, at least in my brief experimentations of trying to match the effect, there is almost like a step function of delay where it's seeing the transient of your guitar, like each pick attack, each new note is changing the amount of time, amount of delay offset versus the raw guitar signal. That's why it doesn't sound fake, like it doesn't have that 30 millisecond or 11 millisecond offset that a lot of people use, which sounds fine, but eventually, at least for me, my ears get used to that, and it no longer sounds double tracked after like 30 seconds. Like my brain figures it out. Whereas with the Mimic, it seems to be changing that offset constantly, just like you would if you were, another guitar player playing to the other one. It's never going to be perfectly in sync, or maybe sometimes it's pretty close to in sync, but each one of those pick attacks is going to be just slightly different versus the reference signal. On top of that, it seems like the pitch modulates just so slightly up and down each time, and it might be random, it might be a prefix function, whatever it is. It sounds real because of that, and no amount of LFO or like random type of generation like that makes it sound right in current delay algorithms for me. It always sounds like warbly and always like when I try to do it even the most subtle settings. So yeah, I would love a real double tracker in the Fractal firmware, even if it's something on the output that you can just, or input for that matter, that you can just turn on at will and it shoots up your CPU usage by 5-10%. That's fine by me. Wish number 4, solid state amplifiers. I've said it before and I'll say it again, especially with the drive pedal block receiving so many new drive pedal models over the years, that I thought maybe that's why they're not implementing it, because their transistor algorithm just isn't up to where their tube modeling is. That doesn't appear to be the case, because a lot of the transistor-based drive pedals are just amazing, especially considering you can change a lot of the clipping structures between op amps and FETs and different things like that. I think they could honestly stick a lot of these solid state circuits into the drive pedal block, or just make a whole new block entirely without all of the, the niceties that are there with the full-fledged amp model block. And that would suffice. Not only would it suffice, it'd probably be just perfect, because a lot of the things that tube amplifiers do, solid state amps don't. It is a lot of the times more akin to a pedal circuit. And I think even with hybrid amplifiers, something like the Valve State series, one tube, you got a couple triodes in there, there's already, like valve driver type of models in the drive pedal block. So kind of what's the difference to me? Obviously, if you got like negative feedback and you have to, account for speaker impedance and things like that, it could potentially change, but I'm okay with just doing preamp modeling, and I could fake the power amp if I had to. Honestly, using the clean pre-tube model and just turning the gain completely down and having a drive pedal of the RG100 or the Valve State or the Sun Beta lead would be perfectly acceptable to me if that is a limitation of their architecture. If absolutely necessary, I guess they could add a SS amp block instead, but I feel like with how complex some of the pedal circuits are in the drive pedal block, like the MT2 Metal Zone, for instance, I don't think they'd really need to. I think a lot of the fundamental architecture is there, and it makes me question why they're so averse to it. I get that a lot of these amps are not remarkable in most of their settings. I get that. No one plays the Valve State 8100 on OD1. No one plays the RG100 on the clean channel. Most of the stuff is just subpar. It really is compared to what you can get out of a tube amplifier. However, going back to that gear preservation thing, they've done such a great job on capturing even more obscure shit than that, that it makes me question, why not this? We're not talking about some really random specific, signature thing. We're talking about pretty popular amplifiers that were used in, the Florida death metal scene and metal movements all across the world. I think it's important to capture these things, and I'm not saying it has to be priority number one, but it would, once again, be another one of those things where it's like, well, I don't need my Valve States or my RG100 anymore, I guess, and we'll keep them for collector's sake. But those are the kind of tones that if I really want that sound, I don't have a plug-in of it, you got to plug into those things to get that. You can fake it with tube amp models on the Fractal stuff currently, but it's just not the same. And maybe it has something to do with the team knowing they sound worse in a lot of ways, but that's kind of the point to me. They can model things to such a degree of accuracy that the badness will still sound good. And having solid state amp modeling capability would actually potentially help bass players even more than guitar players, because bass amps are kind of few and far between on the Fractal system, to the point that if I were doing nothing but bass playing and I was touring with one, I would highly consider a full-fledged Helix over a Fractal system, unless I was specifically going for that Ampeg or Mesa Boogie sound. There's a lot of bass amps out there that are not covered here, and a lot of it, I think, has to do with the fact that a lot of them are solid state. There's plenty of other iconic tube amps that they're missing too, and I think they need to give more love to the bass side. But what's there is already good. However, they could get the solid state thing under control, maybe throw a couple of the really iconic rack mount units or solid state amplifiers, then that would be another huge win. For my fifth and final wish, which is also software related, this is a bit of a catch-all, but I want more nasty effects, more just signal shredding, gross, garbage, sludgy stuff. I'm talking about the Boss HM2. That really blows my mind that's not in there yet. I'm talking about the Hyperfuzz. I'm talking about the Sun Model T. I'm talking about vintage Mad Amps, stuff that maybe have some clean setting capabilities, but when cranked to oblivion, they are earth-shattering and console destroying for how much near square wave distortion they push out. And this is another one of those instances of maybe it's a bias on Fractal Audio Systems' part of wanting to go towards more nice distortion or stuff that's at least cleaned up and shall we say clear. You know, a 5150 Stealth and a rev generator certainly have a lot more clarity and punch than, you know, one of those fuzzed out Doom machines. But I think once again, it's something that keeps me from fully investing into just the Fractal Audio Systems ecosystem, where I still kind of want one of those Sun Model Ts and a nasty collection of fuzz pedals, because they're not saying there aren't some good fuzz pedals in the box, but there are still sounds out there like the Swedish death metal chainsaw tone or the big fuzzed out, you know, Sun Sleipnir's breath kind of sound that you can kind of fake on the Fractal Audio System stuff, but the amp isn't there, the pedal isn't there. And you kind of lose argument of, well, just fake it when you have 100 Marshall derivatives, right? It's like, why did you go through the trouble of tweaking all these little things that you could probably tweak by yourself and get pretty close? If you're that worried about making sure the entire control range behaves authentically, then why not put the full amp in there when we're asking for something completely new and separate? So I think if they could really dig into those nastier sounds, and some of the solid state stuff is included there, but bass amps and bass fuzz pedals as well. If they can tap that sludge, stoner, spacey, you know, huge earth rumbling kind of tone that I think of from what oftentimes amounts to vintage effects cranked all to hell in ways they were not intended to be, then once again, that would be another corner of guitar gear that for me is still very much analog stuff that when I look at, you know, like a weird, like the Pelotar fuzz or something like that, I think, yeah, I got to buy a pedal for that. When I see, you know, one of those huge aforementioned Doom amplifiers, I got to buy that real amp. Whereas when it comes to a Diesel VH4 or a 5150 or a Bogner Uberschall, I think, I got that in Fractal Audio Systems firmware. And I'd like to get to that point with the nastier side of playing too, because there are dozens of us, damn it. I understand it may not be the biggest market, but once again, for preservation, I think it is important. So that's going to do it for my moaning today. Thanks so very much for sticking to the end. And thank you once again to Fractal Audio Systems for continually improving your products. Not sponsored. And I definitely have no stake in the game when it comes to, you know, their direction as a company. I'm a peon YouTuber in a spare bedroom, but I think a lot of my items will speak for more than just me. There's a lot of people that have similar feelings, and it's only going to help make sure that my next amp modeler upgrade, should I ever need one, depending on the continued support of the FM9, is probably still going to be Fractal Audio. So great job as always. If you'd like to post this anywhere else or share it, we're welcome to do so, because I'm not going to do it. And with that, if you have any other questions or comments, please leave them down below. And we will see you in hopefully a more gear-intensive video next time. Bye.